Hey, thanks for joining us again for another First Chapter Friday. Today I'm going to read you a Kansas notable book. It's called Never Enough Flamingos, and it's by Janelle Diller. This is a series. I believe there's 3 books in this series. And today I'm just going to read you the introduction to see what kind of interests that you might have to come in and check them all out. Here we go. On the surface, this is a story about Mennonites, that quirky, mostly misunderstood religion that many people, if they know anything about us, associate first with odd clothes and no guns. Underneath, of course, it's about a whole lot more, but you'll see that in time. If you already think you know everything about Mennonites, example, your last name is Miller or Hirschberger or Schrag, or you live in one of the Mennonite wombs scattered across the Midwest, Pennsylvania, or Virginia, you can skip this part. Otherwise, read on. The next few pages will be helpful. Most people have funny ideas about Mennonites. They think all women dress in that peculiar cape dress style and wear those funny-looking gauzy caps with strings. The men have beards and wear suspenders instead of belts. We all drive horses and buggies instead of cars. And we live without electricity and install telephones at the end of our farm lane so that not only are we not corrupted by technology, we're very clever in how to follow the letter of our church law, even if we're a bit crafty following the spirit of it. Actually, those aren't Mennonites. Those are the Amish. In a manner of speaking, Mennonites and Amish are kissing cousins. But even that's a risky description since Amish tend not to kiss anyone but other Amish. The Amish splintered off from the Mennonites in the late 17th century and proceeded to freeze in time. Mennonites, on the other hand, continue to change, although we too have had our moments when we've gotten stuck in time or fixed on an idea that had less to do with logical theology and more about just plain resisting anything new. Mennonites were one of the early Anabaptists, a radical strand of the Protestant Reformation in the early 1500s. Martin Luther, who ignited the insurrection, would have been a hero to us, except he stopped short of a true theological coup. He sold out, so he's more of a fallen hero. Of course, he lived a long and full life, even getting a religion named after him. So maybe he knew what he was doing all along. Mennonites, on the other hand, spent a lot of decades living secret religious lives, meeting in caves and out in the forest. Sometimes we didn't even sing hymns, but just silently mouthed the words. Back then, we had a lot of motivation for keeping our religious lives shrouded. If we couldn't keep a good secret, we ended up without a tongue or without eyes or burned at the stake, courtesy of the ever-vigilant Catholic Church, who felt a little touchy about adults actually reading the Bible and making their own decisions regarding the destiny of their very own souls. Now that was a church that resisted new ideas. But that's someone else's story. You can imagine, though, how that sort of history gives birth to some theological oddities. For the most part, Mennonites lived in Central Europe, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, Germany, Switzerland, and Prussia. Somewhere around the mid to late 1700s, Catherine the Great invited the German Dutch and Prussian Mennonites to come live in Russia. Those Prussians were the folks who ended up not being from any country at all, since Germany and Russia eventually muscled in on that part of the world and licked the entire country off the map without so much as a please and thank you. Catherine the Great recognized the Mennonites as thrifty, industrious farmers, and she wanted them to do thrifty, industrial things in her country. It was a period of history where lots of people had the any place has to be better than where we're living now bug. So while some of our brethren moved west across the ocean to the new country of America and the fertile lands of Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, a huge group of Mennonites who didn't know any better left the Netherlands, Germany, Prussia, and moved east. They settled in the Ukraine on the flat Russian steppes, where the soil deserves someone as gifted at farming as the Mennonites. For over 100 years we lived there before some elder must have slapped his head one morning and said, "Oh, what are we doing here? We could be living in America." And we migrated to the United States, literally. Entire villages packed up and lifted their roots and shifted off to places like Kansas and North Dakota and other places that made wiser people scratch their heads. Think about it. You had a choice of living anywhere in the entire continent. Would you choose North Dakota? Of course, the decision didn't happen quite like that. But it does make you wonder why people would just pick up and leave a place where they lived for a century, doesn't it? We left because local politics had shifted against the Mennonites for a variety of reasons. For starters, Catherine the Great eventually died, as monarchs do, and left a string of heirs who didn't have the same vision for making the land productive. They also began to re engage on Catherine's promise that the Mennonite boys didn't have to be conscripted into the army. Mennonites have a couple peculiar theological twists that are a natural outcome of all that persecution and secrecy. The most distinctive is that we're pacifists. Since life has value, we're not to take someone else's life. We've really sunk our teeth into this concept over the years. Some people would say at the expense of logic and reality, but in the late 1800s, when faced with the choice of stay and join the military or move, we moved. The other reason the Mennonites left Russia was because, quite frankly, our neighbors had started to get a little irritated with us. True, we were excellent farmers. The land had never produced so much, nor had the Russian villages ever been so prosperous. Unfortunately, though, kind tends to kind. We certainly weren't the first group to think of this tenet, but during this period we would have liked to have added it as an 11th commandment. We bought from each other and sold to each other. We married each other and hardly even learned how to cook the local food, borscht and Varenica being about the only exception. Probably the greatest insult, though, was that we lived in the heart of Mother Russia for over 100 years, more than 4 generations, and never trifled with learning their language, continuing to speak German instead. Of course, this saved us many heartaches. If Mennonite daughters couldn't talk the native language, they wouldn't go off and marry a foreign boy. This assumes, of course, that a boy can still be a foreigner when we've lived next door to his family for 100 years, and you moved in a couple of centuries after that. We could talk enough Russian for good commerce and to direct the hired help, but we didn't need to learn enough to discuss ideas. The Russians didn't have any ideas to speak of, and we Mennonites weren't about to give away any of ours. When we Russian Mennonites first moved to the U.S. in the 1870s, we saw ourselves as temporary residents here. We were planning to stay only 100 years, 200 at the outside, and what had worked for us the previous 100 years seemed to be quite workable for the next. In fact, when I was born in 1925, my family had been in America for 40 to 45 years, and my parents still preferred to talk only German at home. It wasn't until my brother started school in 28 that they made the painful switch to talking English. So somewhere amongst the folds of my brain, I have at least 3 years' worth of earthy omelets and great guttural syllables. To this day, German is like a comfort food to me, even though I don't understand it or speak it. Everything I know about Russia comes from listening to my dad's parents, who had been old enough to miss it when they left. Grandma kept 2 old photographs on her dresser that spun lots of stories and made her sad. One of the photos was from when she was 6 or 7. The other was taken the summer before they abruptly left the Ukraine. The first photo was full of girls in white dresses with poofy white bows in their hair and stern-looking young men in stiff white collars, artfully arranged against